I have a few brief announcements. If you have questions or comments, please raise them in the Q&A box or the group chat, which can be found at the bottom of your screens. WSBA staff are here to support and assist you in your conference experience. This session has been accredited for 1.25 other CLE credits. WSBA CLE will report your credit hours based on you submitting a credit adjustment form to cle@wsba.org, found in the front pages of the coursebook. Materials for this session, as applicable, may be found in your coursebook. WSBA CLE will report credit hours within 30 days and request that you submit your credit adjustment form immediately following the conclusion of the conference. If you have any questions, please contact cle@wsba.org. The coursebook will be updated in the weeks following the conference. This session is being recorded for later replay. And now it is my pleasure to introduce your panelists for this afternoon, Dr. Dana Cuomo and Danyelle McNeary.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you so much to all of you for attending the panel. We're going to introduce ourselves briefly and then get right into content for today. And just to reiterate that we'll ask that you put any questions into the chat box that we appreciate that there are a lot of people here who work with survivors, and we hope that the chat box will also be a place for creating a community of shared resources. So please also feel free to add resources that you think will be helpful to all of us here in the chat box as well. So my name's Dana Cuomo. I'm a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, where I specialize in legal responses to gender-based violence and technology-enabled coercive control. I also worked for 5 years as an advocate for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, with some of that time in Seattle, which is my connection to the state of Washington.
Hey, and I'm Danyelle McNeary. I'm an attorney at the Sexual Violence Law Center, where I have been for about 1.5 years. Before that, in some capacity or another, I've been working or studying at the intersection of technology and gender-based violence for about 4 or 5 years in total. And it's a subject that I'm really passionate about. So I'm really excited to be presenting with Dr. Cuomo today. And just want to thank you all so much for logging in. So with that, we'll get started. A little bit more about SDLC, and we can move on to the next slide. SDLC is a 6-attorney nonprofit law firm providing emergency legal services to survivors of sexual violence, including assault, stalking, abuse, harassment, and technology abuse throughout the state of Washington. We serve all gender identities, all ages, so adults and children clients. And one really important thing about SDLC is that we serve in a holistic, trauma-informed, and increasingly technology-informed way. So holistic, meaning we address all the legal issues that a survivor faces as a result of the sexual assault. So you might know that the average low-income individual experiences 7 to 8 legal issues, but that increases dramatically when domestic violence or sexual violence is involved to 18 to 19 legal issues per survivor or after the sexual assault. So trauma-informed, meaning we adapt our advocacy based on the survivor's needs and trauma, and we'll get into a little bit of that really throughout the presentation today. And then technology informed, recognizing that technology, you know, as you might be aware, especially with COVID and quarantine, plays a huge role in how survivors are abused and face violence. So in supporting our survivors, we provide litigation assistance, taking cases on for direct representation or on a consulting basis, or in our legal line where we work with advocates and support people for survivors as well. Also through advocacy, legislation or policy reform, education, training such as this one, and one that we have coming up here on August 19th. And you'll probably hear that date a couple of times. There are a few places where I want to plug that in. And generally just connecting survivors to other resources, whether that be mental health professionals who also focus on giving service from a trauma-informed, holistic, and increasingly technology-informed lens. And we can move on to the next slide. So just as a reminder, sexual violence is the invisible pandemic. Many of us are survivors, and we all know survivors. So whether or not they've disclosed their experience, please be respectful with any chats that you leave, or comments or questions that you leave in the chat box today. And just remember that 1 in 3 women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime, 1 in 6 men, and nearly 50% of all transgender and non-conforming, gender non-conforming persons will experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. So if you factor in these and other identities, the numbers increase drastically. So with that, I'll let Dr. Cuomo take over and talk a little bit about our agenda today and some of what she's been studying.
Thanks, Danielle. So our plan for today, I'm going to start out by setting up the conceptual framework for technology-enabled coercive control, including different types of tech abuse that we're seeing. And then Danielle is going to pick back up with content regarding how to respond to survivors who are experiencing tech abuse, and she'll walk you through some useful skills specifically regarding digital privacy and safety planning that you'll be able to use when working with survivors. And then she'll wrap up with some specific considerations regarding tech abuse and the court system. Can you move on to the next slide? Thanks. So to begin, we want to briefly introduce the concept of coercive control in our Seattle-based working group, which we call the Technology-Enabled Coercive Control Initiative. Next slide. The tech initiative, and if you can kind of move forward through a couple of points there. The tech initiative is a multidisciplinary group of advocates, attorneys, researchers, and technologists currently housed within the Seattle-based Sexual Violence Law Center. And we have a multi-part objective to our work. We seek to increase understanding of tech across various sectors, oftentimes by facilitating training such as this and education locally at the state level and also nationally, and for a variety of practitioner groups, from advocates to law enforcement to attorneys to judicial officers. We also create or adopt technology tools that help people safely exit abusive situations, which Danielle is going to cover in detail later in the presentation. We advance research that sheds light on survivor experiences and offers potential avenues of support to survivors. And we also develop recommendations for tech companies, law enforcement, and the legal system to adapt to this rapidly changing threat to survivors' livelihoods. And we also encourage the development of support systems for victims of technology-enabled coercive control. So one such initiative includes the tech clinic that we began about 4 years ago, one of 2 tech clinics in the country. It's housed within the community-based domestic violence agency, New Beginnings in Seattle, and it mirrors the legal aid clinic model by connecting volunteer tech experts with survivors who have concerns that their devices might have been compromised. So if anyone's interested in learning more about our tech clinic, please let us know. Can you switch slides, please? So I've been leading an ongoing research project for the last 3 years in collaboration with members of the Tech Initiative. This is applied evidence-based research that's directly situated within our local community, and we produce white paper reports with our findings and recommendations that you'll see pictured here that we then go on to distribute back to stakeholders. So we're happy to share these white paper reports with you too, if you're interested. So what I'll be sharing today includes findings and recommendations from one such research project conducted with Natalie Dolce, a Tech Initiative member and the community researcher on the project. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start out by talking about coercive control more broadly before getting into how abusers use digital technologies in their patterns of abuse, what we call tech-enabled coercive control. And in terms of a content warning, we will be sharing survivor experiences here shortly. Okay, so coercive control serves as a corrective to traditional understandings of gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence, that have centered on one-off incidents of physical abuse. And instead, coercive control recognizes gender-based violence as a broad pattern of controlling behavior that includes verbal, emotional, psychological, financial, sexual, and/or physical abuse. So Evan Stark, one of the leading domestic violence scholars, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, he uses coercive control to frame gender-based violence as a quote unquote liberty crime, in which abusers seek to entrap victims, undermine their social support, subvert their autonomy, and deprive them of equality through threats of violence, dependence, isolation, and intimidation. So examples of coercive control are endless, including abusers who deprive survivors of sleep to sabotage their job performance, which reflects both psychological abuse and serves as a tactic to entrench survivors' financial dependence on abusers should they be fired. Or abusers who restrict survivors' phone access to isolate them from friends and family, which also serves to distance survivors from networks of escape. So what you'll note from these examples is that physical violence might not be part of the survivor's experience of abuse at all. And as Stark notes, the spatial extension of coercive control and the use of tactics to penetrate everyday life means that the typical condition of victims is to be free and subjugated at once. And this twofold condition is also temporal. Abusers who use physical abuse or threats of violence in the beginning of a relationship may only need to use a certain tone of voice to elicit similar compliance over time. Or abusers who escalate and become homicidal after the survivor ends the relationship, illustrating that spatial proximity, or how close the abuser is to the survivor, bears little relevance to the survivor's experiences of entrapment and can continue over the duration of a survivor's life. So one of the reasons that we like the framework of coercive control is because it helps us move away from what has traditionally been a really limited understanding of domestic violence as mostly defined by physical abuse. And this limited understanding of domestic violence as tied to physical abuse has also been reflected within our legal definitions as well. So what coercive control helps us understand is that when we only conceptualize or define domestic violence as physical abuse, it fails to capture the totality of what survivors are experiencing within an abusive relationship. Because, as Stark notes, viewing domestic violence, quote, through the prism of the incident-specific and injury-based definition of violence has concealed its major components, dynamics, and effects, including the fact that it is neither domestic nor primarily about violence. It's really about control. Can you advance the slide, please? So we extend the framework of coercive control, and can you click forward one more? Thanks, Karen. We extend the framework of coercive control to highlight how digital technologies have become central tools for abusers to threaten, stalk, harass, and surveil their partners. We call this technology-enabled coercive control, or tech for short. We situate tech as a continuation of harm perpetrated by abusers rather than a new or distinct form of abuse. In other words, the same underlying dynamics of coercive control are present in both tech-free, or what we might think of as more traditional forms of coercive control that you see on the list on the left side of the slide, and when digital technologies are involved, what you see on the right side of the slide. So with the rest of my time before turning it back over to Danyelle, I'm going to highlight examples of tech that were prominent in our research to illustrate how abusers use digital technologies to extend their control over survivors and how this control permeates and pervades every aspect of a survivor's life. Next slide, please. So to begin, digital technologies, which include smartphones, GPS and location finding applications, social media platforms, online banking, and Internet of Things technologies, we want to highlight that these represent central rather than ancillary tools of abuse in the 21st century. So what research continues to reinforce is that the increased accessibility, usability, and affordability of many digital technologies have lowered the threshold for abusers to perpetrate harm. The pervasiveness of tech abuse can't be underscored. One of the advocates we interviewed noted how economical coercive control has become with digital technologies, explaining, quote, they don't have to stand outside the victim's place anymore in the rain. It's more comfortable to do it from the couch. Social media has created a platform for easier access and convenience. And as the quote from the advocate details, abusers turn to digital technologies for their convenience and efficiency as these new tools can be employed from any location, requiring less effort and reducing their chances of detection. Next slide. So in terms of different types of technology-enabled coercive control, I'm going to highlight 3 here: multimodal harassment, surveillance, and the distribution of intimate images. Next slide. So research participants identified multimodal harassment, unwelcome, harassing contact using a variety of platforms, as one of the most common tactics relied upon by abusers. When multimodal harassment is in use, survivors often receive simultaneous and repeat contact from text messages, phone calls, social media, dating apps, and email. In these instances, survivors describe being quote unquote blasted with the same message, threat, or demand on multiple platforms, sometimes up to and exceeding hundreds of contacts a day. A domestic violence detective described a case involving an abuser who moved between multiple platforms and accounts to harass the survivor. He said, quote, "I had one abuser who created, I think it was 20 different email addresses to continue harassing their ex-partner. He was sending text messages and calling too. He used a text application that can mask phone numbers or generate new ones. Basically, you just type in an area code that you're hoping for and a new phone number will generate. I think he used 10 in that investigation." So often the content of multimodal harassment fluctuates within short periods of time. A survivor might awaken in the morning to discover hundreds of harassing messages from the abuser that began overnight with apologies and requests to reestablish the relationship. Then over the course of hours, when the survivor was asleep and not responding, the content escalates to direct threats or campaigns to discredit the survivor. A survivor who we interviewed described, quote, "It would go from, I love you, I love you, I love you, I can't live without you, to you're an effing whore, I'm going to destroy your family, I have so much effing shit on you, to I love you, I'm so sorry for what I've done, I don't want to be with anyone but you." So digital technologies have become such effective tools of multimodal harassment because the abuser's proximity to the survivor is immaterial, and they enable the abuser to pervade every aspect of a survivor's real and virtual life. This occurs in the most embodied of ways. Every time the survivor's phone rings or vibrates to signal a new text message, the survivor feels in their hand the abuser's attempt to threaten, harass, and control. Every time the survivor checks their email at home or at work, they describe sitting with a lump of dread in their stomachs, waiting in anticipation for what they'll find in their inbox. Abusers' intimate knowledge of survivors results in multimodal harassment that is targeted and deliberate. And digital technologies enable a volume of multimodal harassment executed with a level of efficiency incapable with analog or traditional tactics. Next slide. So in addition to multimodal harassment, research participants discussed a variety of tech-specific surveillance, monitoring, and tracking behaviors. Some of these location tracking efforts involved overt tactics, including tagging on social media or utilizing applications that come preloaded on devices, such as the Find My Friends app. Abusers also use covert efforts, such as secretly installing location tracking apps onto survivors' devices or vehicles, or enabling location tracking apps on their children's devices as a mechanism to surveil survivors. Research participants also cited Internet of Things technologies as common surveillance strategies, where abusers use Nest cameras, nanny cams, or remotely accessible baby monitors to live stream video surveillance. Notably, many survivors are aware of the presence of video surveillance, particularly when living with the abuser. For example, an advocate described working with a survivor who would call for support from her closet. The advocate explained, quote, "I would say, are you in a safe place?" And she answered, "Well, no, my husband's at work, but he has cameras in the room and he watches me from his desktop." Research participants also highlighted instances of abusers secretly installing video surveillance, particularly when attempting to regain control of a survivor who had ended the relationship. A domestic violence detective described a case involving a survivor who had filed for divorce, but her husband still had a key to her house and installed an iPad in the ceiling above her bed to live stream video because he believed she was seeing other men. Survivors who might have once found reprieve from coercive control when their abusers left the home for work are now under constant and unremitting surveillance, negating the need for the abuser to remain within physical proximity to monitor the survivor's behavior, and also making it more difficult for survivors to leave an abusive relationship without alerting the abuser. An advocate explained, "The survivors who I've worked with really feel like it's never going to stop. We'll be writing up the petition and the person will be texting them while we're writing it. And the survivor's like, he probably knows I'm here. They feel like there's no safe place where they can go." Research participants describe survivors of tech living in an unrelenting state of fear in which they feel and believe that there is no escape from the abuser's monitoring and surveillance. And this fear is felt in distinct ways. As digital technologies enable abusers to engage in surveillance regardless of physical proximity to the survivor, survivors need not look over their shoulders anymore when they leave their homes. They assume the abuser is monitoring them with digital technologies, and the effect of this omnipresence is often hopelessness. Next slide. So the final form of tech we want to introduce is the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. These images are generated in a variety of ways. Sometimes the images are captured consensually during positive periods of the relationship. In other situations, the abuser obtains the images covertly through hidden cameras or secretly recording webcam communications. Research participants noted that the threat alone to distribute intimate images was often enough to keep a survivor in a relationship or coerce a survivor back to a relationship. For example, a survivor described having sex with her abusive boyfriend and then ending the relationship not long after. Quote, "So I stopped talking to him, and then I got an email from him and it's a video of me. I'm naked in it. Turns out he had a camera on his desk that was facing the bed and he had recorded the entire thing. He would then threaten me to make it seem like he was going to send it to people, and so that got me talking to him again because I was afraid if I didn't, he was going to post it." Research participants also highlighted how multiple and overlapping oppressive systems create additional impacts for survivors. For example, an advocate who works with bi, trans, lesbian, and gay survivors explained that abusers often deliberately threaten to distribute intimate images to queer and trans survivors' workplaces with the goal of outing the survivor at work. The effect of an abuser's threat to distribute intimate images extends beyond the humiliation or shame that a survivor might be concerned about should the abuser follow through with the threat. Survivors need only watch how the public responds to high-profile cases of non-consensual distribution of intimate images to imagine the outcome for themselves. For example, when US Congressional Representative Katie Hill's abusive ex-husband shared intimate images of her with a media outlet, the public focus shifted to her alleged misconduct rather than viewing her as a victim of her abuser's criminal behavior. So Representative Hill resigned from her position, giving up her political career. And as of this panel, Hill's ex-husband has faced no repercussions for distributing the intimate images. So if victims of high-profile tech cases face negative personal and professional repercussions without consequences for the abuser, the everyday survivor knows how unlikely it is that they would experience a different outcome. So in this way, distributing or threatening to distribute intimate images is such an effective tactic of coercive control in keeping survivors in abusive relationships because survivors know that they will be blamed for their abuser's abuse. In other words, the very systems of oppression that are at the root of tech, patriarchy and sexism, are also responsible for why survivors of tech stay with the abuser. Next slide. So I want to wrap up by saying that while we discussed multimodal harassment, surveillance, and the distribution of intimate images individually, abusers often employ multiple and overlapping methods of tech at the same time. And that once entrapped, digital technologies enable abusers to further their control of survivors in ways that become difficult to disentangle from. We also want to reinforce that digital technologies have become central features of everyday life, and abusers benefit from the way that their ubiquity has reduced and changed expectations of privacy among people, including within intimate relationships. Surveillance cameras on street corners and within the home, quote unquote Facebook stalking, the open sharing of personal information and images on social media, constant connectivity through text messaging. These all normalize a boundarylessness, which creates conditions, especially at the start of a relationship, that abusers manipulate. So this is something that we also want to keep an eye on as we're thinking about the next generation of domestic violence victims and abusers. We're seeing troubling trends emerging in research regarding tech and teen dating violence, where expectations of constant connectivity and information sharing are only compounded among our youth, setting up the perfect storm for young people who are being socially conditioned from an early age to feel an expectation to share such information, and who also feel entitled to have access to a person's every move or activity. And as Danyelle will go on to discuss, it can be seemingly small tech decisions that can quickly wreak havoc on a survivor's life. For example, a lot of people share email passwords with their partners. We've worked with so many survivors who have been locked out of their email accounts, which then goes on to affect their entire lives, because our primary email account is often the key to the kingdom, serving as access to all other online activity, from our social media platforms to our online banking. And once an abuser has access to the password and can change that password and recovery information, the survivor is effectively locked out of their life. So again, tech is pervasive and is only going to become more so. And if you're not already raising tech as an issue with survivors, we hope asking about tech becomes a regular part of your digital privacy conversations and safety planning practices. And I'll turn it over now to Danyelle, who will be sharing insight regarding just that.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was really great. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll just remind you about those 7 to 8 legal issues that people on average will face, especially low income. And this graph is one depiction of that. So another way to understand it is just to think about the data that we do already have available. So this graph from the Washington Civil Legal Needs study, which was published in 2015, looks at legal needs and barriers experienced by Washington low income and indigent community. The study is how we know that the average low income person will experience 7 to 8 legal issues. And again, when there's a domestic violence or sexual assault component, that increases dramatically. I'd be interested to know if because this study was before my time, but I'd be interested to know if that healthcare component includes mental health. Mental health specifically is called, or if mental health is specifically called out in a separate study, or Title IX issues that might arise. And then again, technology abuse is also not listed on that, but there are plenty of litigation or civil or criminal legal issues that arise from technology abuse. So these are things that a lot of people don't see, but they do have real physical and mental effects on survivors of sexual assault. So you're talking about people who already have low income, who are already facing these other average legal issues that arise, but when their reputation is destroyed after a nude photo of them is sent to their employer, or when they've lost their job because they've had a nervous breakdown and had to miss work, or they're having to take off work because they're being constantly vigilant from cyber stalking, the financial and legal impact of that tends to start to feel insurmountable. Next slide. So being able to identify not only that tech abuse is occurring, but how it's occurring is crucial to assisting survivors throughout this process or this crisis. So this section, we're going to identify some of the most common sources of evidence of tech-enabled abuse or coercive control, and best practices for interviewing survivors. Okay, so some of the most common day-to-day apps listed here are apps that you're most likely familiar with because you use them every day, and that is just a demonstration of how pervasive this is. Text messaging, other messaging apps like direct messaging in Facebook and Instagram, voicemails, website data from social media, job boards, involuntary pornography sites like myex.com, thanks to some other movements and research like what Dr. Cuomo is doing, some of this is being brought to light more, and some of those pornography sites that post involuntary pornography are finally being taken down, but there's still a lot of work to do. And email. Email is another way that technology, coercive control is captured. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll get into a couple more forms of cyber harassment. This one you'll have to just keep clicking through. I'm sorry. Blame my teammates who helped put this together. So cyberbullying, I would love to be able to give an example of each of these, but we just don't have that time. But I will try to define each of these briefly. Cyberbullying is calculated and ongoing behavior used by individuals and groups wishing to inflict harm on or cause distress to their target. Doxing, which is actually a different name for docs, like documents, is when someone will actually gather a bunch of information, personally identifying information, nude images, social security information, credit card information, credit reports, mortgage details, everything that they can gather on a target and just send it out, usually with the hope of that person being targeted or stalked physically and just making their life hell. Cyber stalking is one that we see a lot at SDLC and at the clinics. Dr. Cuomo mentioned 2 clinics that are practicing or helping with this issue. One of them is Techie, the other one is the Cornell University Clinic to End Tech Abuse. I'm a consultant there, and this is something that we see quite a bit, is cyber stalking, where the person will just, be somewhere and their ex or their abuser or their stalker is also there. So when we go into privacy or some of the privacy settings later on, I'll show you how easy it is to get someone's location, especially if you already share accounts with them. Google bombing, I won't go through all of these. Google bombing is really detrimental. And when you're talking about reputational damage, Google bombing is something that comes up a lot because it's really easy for someone to just post information about someone and use a hashtag, tag their name or tag their business or what have you. And then that is the thing, once people start clicking on it, that Google creates an algorithm for and thinks, oh, this is important. Let me go ahead and put this at the top of the list. So that thing gets clicked on a bunch more times. And the more that it gets clicked on, the more Google is going to put it at the top of the list. So, think about somebody with a deranged mind or just an abusive character really wants to ruin someone's reputation. That's how they sometimes go about it. So I'm not going to go through the rest of these because we just don't have time. But like I said, I wish I could give an example of each type. But we will have, like I said, another training on this, and we will be able to go into some of these in a little bit more depth. But follow our social media accounts, and we'll be able to provide information on when we're giving these programs. And this is also something that Techie is developing podcasts around, where we're going to talk about more of these things, provide stories and examples of how to address these issues more importantly. But the takeaway here from this slide is that it's not always just one of these at a time. Sometimes it's more than one at a time, and that's how it can get so overwhelming. You have your naked photos online where your boss can see, and all of your information is being posted online. Oh, and someone's hacked into your bank account. So it can really cause a lot of harm, including death in some of the gravest cases where people just give up and either commit suicide or homicide from a stranger or from someone that you know. So the consequences of any or all of these combined or separate are really, really severe. So now we have our first opportunity to poll the audience, and thank you again, everyone, for joining. Tell us about some of these that you may have seen in your practice or that you really didn't think was a big deal, but after just a few minutes into the presentation, realize that it is. So we'd be happy to share or to hear about some of those, but we'll keep going so that we don't waste too much time. So when you're starting to gather information about tech abuse, and we can move on to the next slide. The most important thing is to center the survivor. Remember, this is trauma-informed advocacy, and the victim is the main source of evidence. They know their story the best. They know what they're going through better than anybody. Trust me if you've never worked with anybody in this realm before, but I'm guessing that most of you have. Avoid re-traumatizing, so take your time, don't rush, mirror emotions, try to be empathetic and not sympathetic, be willing to take over the evidence gathering if that's what the person wants. And your role is more of an in-house counsel role. You're gathering information and you're speaking frequently and educating a lot of the times and providing advice on how to communicate with the abuser if that's what needs to happen via text or via email. So in a lot of ways, you will be gathering information directly if that is what the survivor needs. So it's great to continue educating ourselves, all of us, about how to do that. And next slide. So in your initial meeting with the survivor, it might come to more than just one meeting. You want to follow, here's one protocol that you can follow. Create a timeline of everything that has been going on. How long has it been going on? And consider statutes of limitations. Get the key facts, including whether or not there are vulnerabilities, such as immigration status, or whether there are children involved and you might have some custody issues, the location of where these things are happening. So consider jurisdiction and venue. And when you're talking from a technology-informed lens, you might know that the communication component of it might actually be multi-jurisdictional when you're talking about, that's a more in-depth conversation, but it might be multi-jurisdictional when you're talking about communication going from one person in one state to another state. So identify whether or not there are any other witnesses that you might be able to talk with and how you're going to talk with them, and electronically stored information, where is that all coming from? So consider the evidentiary concerns, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, and alternatives to just deleting information or blocking a person. You might, if you're a survivor or you're working with someone who is constantly being barraged by offensive emails, you might consider placing those emails like an auto function in Google or Outlook, where it automatically gets sent to a folder, so that from a trauma-informed perspective, they don't have to look at it. But from a technology-informed perspective, you know that you're funneling that information somewhere that it's still going to be accessible, so that you can use it if you need it in evidence at a later time. Okay, so let's move on. And this is just a reminder that from the trauma-informed perspective, a person's brain might not be recalling all the details in one meeting, and it might come out in layers. So again, you might have to have multiple meetings, and you might have to take off your lawyer hat for just a second and think about what this person might personally be going through. For example, I was working with someone whose abuser forced them. If you know about Instagram, you know that there are these polls that you can take on Instagram on your stories, and it can be a one question. You only get two options for the answer: yes or no, or this or that. And this person's abuser would literally stand over her and guilt trip her into following or answering his polls on an almost daily basis, and would say things like, oh, my 500 women followers are supporting me and taking these polls, so if you don't do it, you must not be that loyal, et cetera, et cetera. So this survivor was forced and guilt tripped into making this decision every single day: this or that, this or that, this or that, this or that, for about 30 questions every day. So she eventually had a nervous breakdown and acute schizophrenia. And so when she did finally come back to, one thing that impacted her brain almost permanently, or we don't know if it's permanently, still ongoing, is that she was not able to make decisions as easily as she was prior to this relationship. So that is how one way where trauma and technology and just being a victim of domestic violence can all interlay. So when you're having this person sit in front of you and you're asking them, do you want a protection order or not? You have to think about what kind of impact or what kind of, re-traumatization you might be doing. And it's impossible to tell in every case, which is why you have to actually listen to your clients and the survivors and see how they might be showing up. So of course, some of the questions that you might ask are here on the slide. How do you communicate with the abuser? You might ask, may I look at your text? If you're having a virtual conference, you might want to consider asking their permission to have the cameras on or off. And this is something that we are increasingly learning as well, talking with mental health professionals who are also focusing on technology abuse survivors. So we can go on to the next slide. The biggest question that you want to know when you're talking about technology and tech-enabled coercive control is it safe to disconnect? You might not know what the abuser is going to do once they realize that their access to this person's accounts has been cut off. So when we get into some of the safety planning and the investigation planning, this is going to be a really big question to consider before moving forward. Is it safe to disconnect, or do we need to plan this out so that we can do it at a time that's more appropriate? Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about conducting those privacy checkups and doing safety planning with survivors and investigation planning, which is a part of the safety planning. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Karen. So what if the survivor's only and primary concern, which is often the case, is securing their accounts and skipping out on the legal process altogether? Part of the trauma-informed approach is listening to that, acknowledging that, and saying, okay, I'm going to support you, and we're only going to see how we go about securing your person and securing your devices, and not worry about, implementing any legal processes. Oftentimes for one reason or another, whether it be fear of retaliation, wanting to just be done with a situation or what have you, survivors just don't want to go to court. They don't like even the idea of it. And so just wanting some assistance to secure themselves is important. And it's important for us as advocates and attorneys to be respectful of that. So part of that security can and should be found in the virtual space. And there are considerations that need to be had prior to taking steps to ensure that accounts, including safety, are conducted, including safety planning before disconnecting the accounts, like we've been saying. Also, when you do find that it's safe to disconnect or secure account, it'll be important to do it in a way that actually provides the survivor with assurance that they've actually protected their information, either through setting strong passwords, which we'll go through in a little bit, or equipping them with the information and the empowerment to be able to manage their own online and tech security. And that is something that the two clinics are doing really great work with right now in informing, educating, and empowering survivors to do that stuff on their own. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned earlier CETA, which is the Clinic Ending Tech Abuse in New York, and their definition of disconnecting is ensuring that the clients are not unintentionally sharing accounts with their abuser. So that includes, and it does parallel some of what Techie does, and part of that includes making a list of all current devices, making a list of all accounts and how the survivor is accessing each account, who has access to the account, who has physical access to the device. Consider risks of signing out, changing passwords, etc. Some specific questions to ask are, again, whether anyone has physical access to the device or knowledge of the passwords to the account, or do they force their way in? Are they disguising it as just wanting to see what the person is up to? Not only is it good to know how the accounts and devices are being accessed for escalation prevention purposes, but it's also good to know just good technology hygiene and for ourselves and for survivors to consider in the future to prevent future breaches. Because physical access gives a person the ability to just go ahead and download some stalkerware on there, for example, without anybody really knowing. It's really easy and quick to do. Another question you might want to ask is whether there's any other way for an abuser or a perpetrator to access the accounts, whether that be through a shared device, a family plan. A lot of survivors have children in common with their perpetrators or their abusers. So you might want to consider whether or not the children have applications on their phone that are being shared with both parents, etc. So again, I wish we had more time to go into some of these programs, but Techie and CETA all have great resources on this and continue to develop resources, especially Techie right here in Seattle that has Seattle specific and is developing Seattle specific information on this. So we will include those pages in the chat, and our executive director is here assisting in the chat. Thank you so much, Rudy. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is creating a plan, a safety plan, and that includes an investigative plan. So obviously we have to talk about safety planning because a lot of what we're going over with you will give survivors some control over their device. And if there's one thing that we can all agree on about abusers is that they like to be the ones that are in control. So when a survivor starts taking control over their device, their accounts, their information, it could ruffle some feathers. So before making these changes, we really want to consider important questions about how to make them, when they should be made, when the survivor is still in the home, maybe not, or outside of the home in a safe place might be a better idea. What's the plan for physical safety? What's the account for information safety? You know, if all of the passwords, if the person only has one password for all of their accounts, you might need to change them when you're at a time that you're 100% certain that the abuser is not going to be checking the accounts. And then as soon as they see that something has been changed, going ahead and making changes or disseminating personal information while you're trying to change all the other accounts. Things to think about and talk about with your clients. This might also include working with advocates, other team members, law enforcement in some respects, definitely mental health professionals who are increasingly realizing how technology abuse impacts survivors, and look at things like technology triggers. And you might have a therapist on your team because using the trauma-informed approach, you always want to consider about how talking about tech, going through security settings in the phone, asking how an abuser might escalate a situation if you start making changes. All of these things are things to think about because they could inadvertently trigger and cause a crisis or a mental health crisis response. Finally, just consider how disconnecting right now might impact litigation or evidence. If you're working with a survivor who does want to press charges or file a civil claim, it's going to be important to consider evidence gathering throughout your safety planning. Next slide, please. Okay. Just want to check the time. I know that I'm talking really fast. Please forgive me. It's just we have so much information we really want to share. Okay, so now you're moving forward. You're ready to move forward. You have a plan. You know when and how you're going to disconnect. Maybe you've already disconnected, and now it's time to start securing your accounts. Again, August 19th around noon, we'll have a totally separate training on this. And we're hoping to bring in some computer scientists and at other trainings and experts at Techie to give more in-depth guidance on how to navigate the cloud or the code or the Android device or whatever it is that has super technical components that might be at issue. But you know, a lot of that fear of technology or failure to embrace technology is not, hopefully not something that will scare you or the survivors that you're working with. The point of clinics like Techie is to introduce basic steps that you can take to create secure accounts and to just make people feel safer online, and not just feeling safer, but making online a safer, virtual world a safer place. So some rules for creating strong passwords, and I'll try to be quick about this. One of the things that we go over in the clinics is teaching survivors how to create a strong password. And I know that everybody here has heard this 1,000 times because computers are not brand new, but it is important to have a strong password to protect your accounts that people cannot easily guess. Many of us carry our devices everywhere we go, and our devices carry important, personal, confidential information about us, like our brains on these little devices in our hands. So including, your location and sensitive information. So it's important that no one can easily access these devices, especially someone who has a motive or a desire to cause us any harm. Some of the basic rules for creating a strong password is, first, obviously not to use something that can be easily guessed. When I was 13, I had a dog named Moses that I loved, and my password for my computer was "I love Moses." And just because you didn't have a computer when you were 13, it's not an excuse for your password to be 1, 2, 3, 4. As attorneys, we have obligations to keep abreast of the technology changes in technology and how they impact our work, and that includes securing your own accounts, which might have evidence of revenge porn on your own computers when you're processing a case, and advising your client on best practices for securing their own devices. People can guess birthdays, anniversaries, pet names, the year that we're in, nicknames, and so the point is just to choose something else. If you want to create something that's meaningful to you, one thing that you can do is paraphrase, and that is just coming up with a short phrase of something meaningful to you. So if I like pizza, that phrase might be "mushrooms and pineapples belong on pizzas," right? And many of you can disagree, whatever. It's meaningful to me, so I might use that. And I'm going to put in the chat here how I might deduce that to a strong password. Okay, so I put in the chat how I might deduce "mushrooms and pineapples belong on pizzas" into a password. And, that includes changing capitalization, using the first letter or the first 2 letters of any of those particular words, using an ampersand instead of the word "and." Either way, whenever you create a password, you make it 100 times harder for a robot to guess it when you include a mixture of capital letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and you make it 10,000 times harder for a person to hack into that or to guess it. Finally, you want to make sure that your password is long. At least 8 to 12 characters if you have the option. I know for some smart devices, you can only use 4, or you have to do facial recognition, what have you. But wherever you can, use 8 to 12 characters. And in the UK, I know that the average is 22 characters. So you can go ahead and look at the statistics of data breach and all that between the US and UK to see for yourself if 22 is better than 8 to 12. If this seems totally overwhelming and you just don't want to store these anywhere, or you're forgetful, or your clients, like most people, are just overwhelmed that they have so many passwords, complicated passwords to remember, you can always use a password manager. There are some that are free and some that cost money. And the purpose of the password manager is just to keep all of your passwords in one secure location, so that you don't have to memorize them all. Either way, if you are super old school and you want to write it down on a sticky note, the same thing applies. Make sure make sure that it is secure in a secure location. Put it in a lockbox and not just right next to the computer screen or keyboard. Before we move on from this section, I want to highlight one really important security feature, which is 2-factor authentication, which is one of the best gifts that the technology companies have given us. It's one of the most concrete things that anybody can walk away from this training with to tell your clients. is that when it's safe to do so, enable two-factor authentication. It's something that we stress in the clinics as well. And what it is a security feature that requires the user to input two separate and distinct passwords or forms of identification in order to access something. You take two forms of ID when you go take a test or go get your driver's license. It makes perfect sense to require two forms of ID when you are trying to access something that has new photos of you on it. So you'll be notified whenever someone tries to access your device if you have, or your account if you have two-factor authentication enabled. Please stop clicking remind me later when you get that pop-up. Before we move on to this from this slide, I know I said that like 6 times already. If you have an iPhone, I want you to take it out and click on settings in your phone and go to privacy. Privacy is if you have the same version of phone that I do, it's an icon with a blue background and a hand on it like this. So click on privacy. And the very first thing that will pop up, if you can see that, is location settings, location services. And you can see on there whether or not location services is highlighted or grayed out. When it's on, it means that some of your apps, which will show up here on the bottom, are tracking your location. It'll also tell you when it's tracking your location, never tracking, always tracking, or while you're using the app. So the first app on my phone that's tracking my location is the All Trails app. Raise your hand if you know the All Trails app. I know many of you do. So that's an app, Dr. Cuomo does. That's an app that tells you where all the best trails are and where all the worst trails are within your geographic location. So here's a scenario. If you have a survivor who posts on her Instagram that she's been into solo hiking lately, and she uses the All Trails app to find the best hikes and her destination traveling. And she has location services on only when she's using the All Trails app. And all of a sudden, the abuser or a stalker suddenly starts showing up wherever she's hiking. It's so bizarre. And you later learn that somehow that person is just has access to the cloud and to her cloud account through her Gmail where they guess the password. I don't know, use your imagination. But the All Trails app is sending location data to the iCloud where this person is getting current access of the time and location of where that person is. That's how easy it is. That's how quick it is to get access to someone's personal information through these devices, which have really awesome benefits. As we can see, we're having this training virtually, but can also be nightmarish for some people. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on that. Let's move on to the next slide. If you have any questions about that, again, Techie will be putting out some advocacy trainings, and SDLC will also be doing more trainings on stuff just like that. That's what we walk through with survivors, and we'll be walking through with advocates on how to spread the good news of checking privacy settings on your phone. Okay, so let's say your client does want to pursue some type of litigation. So I would stop here. If your client is concerned about disconnecting and securing the device, and you've already ruled out that they don't want to pursue civil or criminal action, you would stop at that previous slide that we just did. You figure out how they're being tracked or how they're being harassed, and you help them secure the account and disconnect when it's safe. If they do want to pursue, then you go all the way back to step one, and you focus on including these considerations for court in your safety plan and in your investigation planning. Okay, we can move on. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left. Okay, so the first thing is to know your court. Once you decide to pursue a legal remedy, there are a lot of factors to consider. Here are just a few of them. Again, we're looking at more detail of the legal process, how to get evidence admitted, how to collect evidence, what statutes we're talking about when we say some of these things are crimes, what laws we're talking about. but we wanted to note it again here, that second bullet, admission of evidence. The first one is educating the bench on tech-enabled coercive control. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at how some judges just say, why can't you just block this guy or girl or person? Why can't you just delete this offensive conduct? Why can't you just send email or Google and say, hey, take this down? You can do all those things, but that's not it. Those questions are akin to, asking a rape survivor if, they could just dress more moderately so that they're not sexually assaulted. And we know how problematic that is. So it's not just that easy. Like I said, some of this is criminal behavior. So even if the court is unaware of the statutes, apart from that, we're just generally educating around this topic. It's about removing the stigma and the pressure from survivors to handle everything and putting the onus back on the perpetrators where it belongs. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So beware of abusive litigation. You may have heard this term floating around a lot more in recent years, but technology-enabled coercive control perpetrators can bring those manipulative tactics into the courtroom. So be prepared for this and be aware of this. Another way to think about the tactics that abusers use and try to minimize and excuse their behavior is a term called DARVO, which is coined by psychology professor Dr. Jennifer Joy Freed from the University of Oregon. And it stands for, and you can click through here and so that animation comes up. But this is what it looks like. It's in the form of frivolous motions and filings. A lot of times we'll see where a survivor we're working on a protection order with will win a protection order. This actually just happened. And the abuser will turn around and file a protection order against their survivor because that one time they got in an argument that was kind of mutual. So you have relitigating issues that have already been litigated, abusing the discovery process, parallel suits in different jurisdictions, etc. And even us as attorneys and advocates in mental health, people who are supporting the survivor would also sometimes be attacked. So DARVO is when the abuser will first deny that this thing ever happened and then attack the survivor. I've seen so many times where the abuser, and in each of these cases, it has been gender specific, where the abuser will say, no, she's just a bad mom. She's just crazy. She is going through, menopause, or she's going through emotions of just having delivered a baby. She's just crazy. And I'm the one who's actually the good person. I'm an excellent employee. So you have this reversal that happens and an attempt to turn the victim into the offender. So we get really animated about that when we see it because it's very classic. And don't use that term in court because the judge will say that you can't call some behavior classic and get away with it. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. And I think this is our last slide before contact information and questions. This is probably one of the biggest concerns when you're talking about filing things into court. Protect and seal information, especially if it's one of those really intimate and potentially embarrassing cases for your client. This is just a reminder that, in any of these cases, the evidence that you're providing is invasive and it's embarrassing to the client, not only to just share it with you, someone who they can trust, hopefully, and who's taking them seriously, but also a neutral / disinterested court. And a mean opposing side, so you have to take proactive steps to protect the information from being submitted into the court record or for sealing it when it is inputted into the record. So you have to use the Issaquah factors in Washington, and they're up there. And we also have some training designed around how to do this and examples of where we have done this in practice. Okay, so last slide is our contact information. We have tried to be organized with this presentation. You all know how it is trying to decide what information is most important when you think all of it is important, including specific examples and real life stories, so that the education and information sharing, it doesn't start here and it doesn't end here. We're working with survivors every single day and providing technical assistance to advocates and attorneys. So please do not hesitate to contact us, follow our social media pages, follow up on Techie. My email is at the bottom of the screen, and our legal line is also on the screen, which might be a better, I'm not saying don't contact me, please do contact me, but legal line might help you get addressed faster or really prevent any messages from falling through the cracks. Okay, so with that, we will open it to questions, either through the chat or I think we might still have the opportunity to unmute folks, but we're running out of time here. So I actually want to pass it back over to Dr. Cuomo to see if there's anything, Dana, that you wanted to add, or any information you wanted to provide.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. No, I think you did a great job, and covered so many things. So I'm happy to hear from participants if there are questions or anything that we can go into more detail about.
I think the presentation will be posted on the Access to Justice YouTube channel. If you want to share this with any survivors or advocates who are already in this work, or new to it and just want somewhere to start. I do have a shameless plug for all of you nerds out there. Danyelle Keats-Citron is one of the founders of this area, and her book Hate Crimes in Cyberspace is a really awesome start. If you don't know anything about anything that we've talked about today, this is a really incredible book to get started with. And also Carrie Goldberg, who has a victims' rights firm in New York, wrote a book called Nobody's Victim, which also is really great, and really gives some personal accounts about every instance of tech-enabled coercive control that we have talked about. So it's definitely, if you're in this work, these are really two great books written. One is written by a survivor to get started in educating yourself. Anything about financial abuse online for domestic violence victims and how victims can report, where to go. You generally have, your basic consumer rights responses for financial abuse. Sometimes you're talking directly to a creditor. Sometimes you're talking directly to a bank and letting them know what's going on. I have called a bank on behalf of a survivor before, and your ability to just articulate what you're seeing and not calling frantic sometimes is like the most helpful thing that you can do. But there are other resources, especially from the consumer rights lens, on how to correct a credit report, how to report a financial abuse incident and stuff like that. So please contact us if that didn't answer the question, or if you want a more in-depth response. Dr. Cuomo, if you have anything on that.
No, that's great. Yeah.
Okay, Chris, I'm sorry, I didn't see your question until now. Enforcement, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's something that we're dealing with too. And the question is about, and not really a question, but it's just a statement. And we are in total agreement with you, Chris. The issue is enforcement. How, when you do get a protection order, the perpetrator finds a way to violate it in a subtle way. And, the survivor calls the police and the police are like, is he still there? Or she still there? Are they still there? And, the survivor says, well, no, they left. And the police say, okay, well, nothing else here, nothing to see, move right along. And that is a huge problem that we're also trying to tackle. One of the things that we are advocating for and have been practicing is filing complaints. Talk with the detective, talk with the supervisor, ask why these things are not being taken seriously or followed up on. Make a note of it for yourself. If you're working with a prosecutor, help the survivor inform the prosecutor of each and every violation that you're seeing. Some prosecutors are going to be more susceptible to that, and some are just not going to. But when you do email the prosecutor, you're also helping to create a record. Continuing to educate the bench, continuing to educate law enforcement, continuing to educate prosecutors and other attorneys that these things, when you go through law school, you learn that it's a powerful tool. And then you go and experience things like this and you're like, well, I don't blame my survivors and my clients for having mistrust in it. So a part of it is advocating for that, power that the law is supposed to hold and actually hold these people accountable once an order is entered, how to follow up. So a lot of it is advocacy. We're working on it, Chris, and would love to talk with you more about what you all are seeing and how we might be able to work together to tackle some of that.
I would add to the more specific language that can go in a protection order, for example, about what constitutes a violation and naming specifically social media can also be helpful when that then lands on law enforcement's desk. And to Rudy's point in the comment, documentation here is so important. And oftentimes this means that the advocate is really going, or the survivor is really going to have to advocate for themselves. And that persistence can be so difficult when a survivor's been experiencing trauma. And so to the extent that the survivor can do that follow-up and be persistent about making sure that a report gets filed, even if nothing happens with it at the time, being able to show that pattern of contact is also helpful. So yeah, I mean, super frustrating. We completely agree. And it's something that you're certainly not alone in terms of supporting survivors who are having repeat contact violations and not seeing kind of progress with those being taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Google Voice number or things where it might be more difficult to prove, please come to our next couple of trainings where we're really going to get into how to tackle some of these harder technical questions. That's where we're trying to bring in our computer scientists and tech experts from Techie to really break down in layman's terms, so we can also go ahead and translate it into legalese about how some of these things are actually traceable and how we do find out that the abuser is the one. It's not just a coincidence that this person is suddenly being called from a random number every 30 seconds, and just ways to document that, even if it's circumstantial evidence.
And I would add too, sometimes going back to kind of old school analog methods are helpful here too, particularly if a survivor is receiving repeated text messages, for example, from an unknown number. If the text message content is using language or cues that the abuser has always used with the survivor, that can be helpful too, to be able to demonstrate that this is the person, right? And so abusers very much like to hide behind this kind of identity, hiding behind their identity.
Anonymity.
Yeah, anonymity. Thank you. It's the word I was looking for. But and sometimes it can be difficult to be able to kind of unravel that through technology, and there are ways, and the upcoming clinic will help kind of decipher some of that. But there are also kind of analog methods to be able to use there too, where we can demonstrate that the same threats that have been used in the past are what are being used currently, using kind of the same type of language.
Mm-hmm. I'll end on this, that we're again focusing on the survivor's story and their knowledge of their own life and their own case. Their hunch is important. When they have a hunch that this is what's happening, figure out a way to understand that hunch and to write it down in a way that will be understandable to law enforcement and to the bench. That's our job, is to be able to help survivors articulate these things that just feel wrong. Thank you so much for coming to our presentation. Thank you, WSBA, for hosting us and for providing the platform and the information, administrative information. Thank you.
Thank you both for such a wonderful session. And that will conclude. We are at time. So thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.